Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 12 of our English 3180 online course. Whew, we are flying. We only have a couple weeks left in this semester, guys. I mean, this week, next week, which is interrupted by Thanksgiving break, and then 2 more weeks, and we're out of here. It's wild. So this week I'm going to be flying kind of high and fast over our readings and just kind of hit some of the high points, give you your chat check-in prompt, and then that's about it. I'm going to close out this video and I'm going to bookend it. I'm beginning and ending with a reminder that you should be working actively on your annotated bibliographies for your final semester paper and thinking about how you will form an argument about your topic or question that you're going to bring to bear on the history of rhetoric before 1800. Okay, I'll remind you about that at the end of the video also. But for right now, I'm going to switch over to our screen view so that I can go over this week's assignments and then get into our mini lecture. Okay. So we are in week 12 talking about belles lettres and the emergence of composition. And I want to note one thing. As I was looking over the readings for this week, I realized that I had meant to remove one of the readings in the Blair lectures. And I realized I hadn't done that yet. So you'll notice that there used to be 2 Blair readings, and now there's only one. I'm just asking you guys to read Lecture 1, his introduction to his volume, Lectures on Rhetoric. And then also as a companion piece, this secondary article by Donald Miller, Where Did College English Studies Come From? Your chat check-in number 12. The prompt for that will be given at the end of this video. Reading response 11 and reading discussion 11 are going to be due this Sunday. All right, so I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint and talk to you very quickly about these 2 readings and some key takeaways from this week. Okay, so this week we're talking about the birth of composition, and that's basically referring to composition as a subject of college instruction. So in other classes, you might talk about the birth of composition studies, which is a discipline that is part of the larger discipline of rhetoric and composition, of which I myself am a scholar. And that doesn't fully come into being until the mid-20th century. So this is something that's different. This is like, if you've ever wondered why you have to take a basic comp course in college, this week we're going to find out why. Dun, dun, dun. So basically, I could have had you read so many things, but I really wanted you to experience one of the seminal pieces that is linked to the belles lettres and birth of composition, and that is Hugh Blair's volume of lectures on rhetoric. Now, Blair was not only a minister in the Church of Scotland, but he was a professor emeritus at the University of Edinburgh. And he gave these lectures verbally over and over and over again in his courses. He gave these lectures for 24 years. And they were known to be very helpful to students, and students would copy them out and sell them to each other, which is really funny and, probably indicative of how students are everywhere. But I think this sort of irked Mr. Blair, and he decided that he would gather them all together and publish them himself. He didn't actually expect to gain a name for himself or even to be compensated very well for the sale of his books. He was like, here, have my versions of them, which sounds like a crotchety kind of college instructor that I might want to be friends with. he's not really presenting any new rhetorical theories here, right? He's not making any arguments about a new idea. He's really pulling together his knowledge of classical rhetoric, mainly Aristotle and Cicero, and then he's also putting that into conversation with some more modern theorists. This is, though, one of the first works to really emphasize written composition, not just oral discourse. So that is one of the key contributions here. And I think when you know that, you can understand why this volume could be so influential on the development of composition as a subject of study. Something that is interesting and maybe a little surprising is that out of all the things that he pulls in from Aristotle, he does reject the Aristotelian idea of using figures of speech or tropes, because he says invention cannot be prescribed. Invention's not something you can sort of work up. You just have to have knowledge of the content. I find that very interesting because some writers might heartily agree and others disagree, but it is a surprising claim that Blair makes. And his focus here, too, is on not just written discourse or oral discourse, but public discourse. And sort of, you'll see he's kind of making an argument for why education matters. And he's going to argue that education matters because it prepares one to enter public discourse effectively. So Blair says, I found this quote really interesting, that I must be allowed to say that when we are employed after a proper manner in the study of composition, so written discourse, we are cultivating reason itself. True rhetoric and sound logic are very nearly allied. So he's making this argument that it's not just a logical verbal argument that helps us to process things rationally. It's a study of how to write it down. Now, this becomes really seminal in terms of our experience of composition as a subject of study, because Blair's works were fairly popular in Europe, but they were extremely popular in America. And his texts were adopted in multiple courses, most notably at Yale and Harvard. Harvard is the university where we historically identify the first college composition course in the United States being taught. Now, I'm not going to get into all of the history of it because oftentimes college composition in this context is looked at as pejorative and gatekeeping, as an systematized way for institutions to codify linguistic gatekeeping. There's a lot going on there. But one of the things I think is interesting is that when we look at Miller's bringing up some really fascinating origins for the same material that Blair is presenting in the late 1700s. And Miller's going to argue that actually the roots of this subject go further back and are much less elitist than Harvard University, using a University of Edinburgh scholar emeritus's work, right? So this, I think, is really fun because Miller is going to not just argue that the origins of composition studies are rooted the century earlier, but he takes pains to identify some of the key scholars and instructors of composition. And he says this isn't happening, it's not originally happening in elite universities like the University of Edinburgh, but in the cultural provinces, and it's being perpetuated by outsiders. Because Miller points out that basically, yes, Scots were teaching composition in Scotland, Americans were teaching composition in America, but before that, English dissenters, so Protestants, reformers, people who were breaking with the Church of England during the Reformation most notably, and then after that, These were the folks who were teaching composition at the college level at the time. So he talks about the middle class Calvinist clergymen as the first instructors of composition, which just gives me a little chuckle. But I think it's a really interesting point because as we're talking this whole semester about historicity and thinking about the main stories that get told and what might be counter narratives or like landscapes where we could shift our view and see even further back or to see on the margins. This article by Miller is really picking up on that theme, right? Because he's pointing out marginalized groups, at least in that culture at the time, right? We don't often think about Protestant clergymen as being cultural outsiders in America and in our modern day, but at this time, in the place where they were at the time period that they were very much ostracized by their culture and community. And so then Miller's going to go on to demonstrate this for us by showing us educational contexts and social contexts that support his argument for looking at these early and first teachers of composition. But I just loved this quote because I think this is a nice sort of summary to end on. College English, so composition studies, or composition as a subject, originated not at elite universities, but in the British cultural provinces as a result of basic disruptions of the dominant educational and cultural traditions. When the dissenters were removed from the classical university curriculum, they began to study the logic, language, and social experience of contemporary life because their direct participation in dominant culture was limited. So this is where Miller is kind of zeroing in on the actual origins of composition as a subject and this idea of studying logic in writing. So there you have it. I am going to close out this mini lecture. I told you I was flying high and fast today, and I am going to give you your chat check-in prompt and close out this video. All right. So your chat check-in prompt for this week is to respond in the chat to this little brief introduction of the history of composition and compare it to your own experience of taking composition. Whether you took it here at Wayne State or you took it elsewhere, we've all taken it or clept out of it somehow. What's your experience with college composition, and how does it affect your experience to think about the history, whether you want to think back through its more elite roots that trace back to Yale and Harvard in the United States, or if you want to think about English dissenters and finding alternate means of education. Take this week's readings and kind of connect them to your own experience with composition. Does it match? Does it shed things in new light? Does it, is it even something that you would have ever imagined taking your composition course? Who knows? I'm excited to read your chats and see what you guys think. All right, so other than that, just keep on keeping on with your research. Keep on emailing me if you have questions about our final project. Enjoy this week's discussion. Please remember to, if you're the question poser, please post your questions by like Thursday or Friday if possible. Give your group a chance to really have a meaningful discussion. And if you're in a group and not the question poser, please start looking at that discussion by like Friday or Saturday so that you can have meaningful interactions with your classmates. You guys are doing awesome. I'm so excited to be moving into our research projects with you guys. I can't wait to talk more about that. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you guys in next week's video. Bye, everybody.